Possibility exists when you're solving an absolute value equation that you could end up with no solution or only just one solution. We saw some of the one solution examples in some of our earlier videos, but in this example I'm going to show you a unique situation that ends us up with one solution. But first, the no solution. Using the thoughts that came from our last example, using the ideas that came from our isolate the absolute value examples, we're going to engage in the same practice here. We add 12 to the right, and then we divide by -3. And we end up with an equation that says 3t minus 2 is equal to -2. Now you're going to have this natural reaction to want to say, all right, well, for all of these other examples, all I had to do was make the inside equal that number, and then make the inside equal the opposite of that number. And while that was true, all of those examples started with something a little bit different than this example. And all of those other examples that we looked at, this number was positive. Because that number was positive, I was actually able to logic our way through wanting this to have an absolute value equal to that. And in the case that you see here, that is actually impossible. There is no way for us to have an absolute value that's equal to a negative number. So despite the fact that I could write this out and I could solve this and get 0, and I could solve this and get 4/3, those are meaningless answers. If you happen to miss that step, and if you happen to engage in the process of solving, as you might imagine, when you went to check those two solutions, they weren't going to work. They weren't going to do what you wanted them to do because it's impossible to get them to do what you want them to do. Both of those answers would have ended up with the interior of this creating a +2 and not a -2. And it really wouldn't have mattered what number we used. We were always going to create a positive answer. The absolute value has that unique characteristic. That's how 4th, 5th, and 6th graders first learn how to do absolute value. The first time they think about it, it's turn the number positive. But really, because it's a distance examination, that's where we're getting the positivity from. Not just because it's this magical operation that turns everything positive. So as a required characteristic of the absolute value, if we get to the case where the absolute value is negative, then there's no way for us to create a solution. Contrast that to this example. What happens when we have an absolute value that's equal to 0? And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that absolute value doesn't equal 0. We still have this negative in the front of the absolute value. If it makes you feel better, you can treat it like a -1. If it makes you feel better, you can imagine dividing it away. But the one thing you certainly cannot do is imagine distributing it to the inside of the absolute value. I prefer to think of it as a -1. That's going to get divided away. And my next line is going to say this. Now, if this was a number over here other than 0, I would have to worry very much about the fact that I just divided it by -1. Did I change the sign? Did I create something like in our last example that couldn't be solved? In this case, I run into a totally different issue. I need my absolute value to be 0. So what's the only way I can make my absolute value equal 0? Well, it's to get 0 out of the inside. This is the only situation where you don't have to write two different equations. You don't have to make the two different attempts at determining what that inside value needs or could be. We need it to come out as 0. We're going to treat it as such. In order to get an absolute value of 0, like here, we need to make sure that the inside has a value of 0.